Today, it's pharmacy wars as Woolworths takes on Wesfarmers. That's our main story. Also this morning, allegations that a government MP physically abused a woman he was having an affair with, Crown half-heartedly rejects a bid from private equity, and the former RBA boss to chair Macquarie Group. It's Friday, the 3rd of December 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Morning, Michael.
Then stay listening for Sean's chat to Cameron Falloon, founder of fitness group BFT, which has just signed a deal worth millions of dollars to expand into the US. But first, Sean, as I mentioned, it's pharmacy wars at 10 paces. Woolworths has jumped into the battle for Australian pharmaceutical industries, pitting themselves against Wesfarmers. This is a big one.
I love this story. There's so many parts to it, Michael. Until Wesfarmers spun out Coles back in 2018, it and Woolworths were the two gorillas in the room in terms of retailing. Well, they're at it again. Woolworths for decades has wanted to get pharmacies into supermarkets. Go to most other nations and you can put your script in, do your groceries and pick up your medicine after you've paid at the checkout. But not in Australia. The Pharmacy Guild has always been very powerful enough to prevent incursions into its territory. And the supermarkets have never been allowed to sell prescriptions, even though many off-the-shelf products are now available. Woolies yesterday made a $1.75 a share bid for API, which until yesterday was almost certainly going to be sold to Wesfarmers. The Woolies bid is much more than the $1.55 offer from Wesfarmers, and API has granted due diligence to Woolies. API is a wholesaler and retailer of drugs. It has a universal service obligation with the government to supply pharmaceuticals within 48 hours anywhere across the country. In return, they get government support. It owns and operates the Priceline Pharmacy, Soul Pattinson and Chemist, and pharmacist advice chains. The winner in all of this is the API shareholders, who will get more for their stock, and API share price yesterday jumped 16%. Now look, the Woolies bid is conditional. It has promised to keep pharmacies open, and there's no certainty it will come off. And it isn't the biggest takeover of the year. In fact, it's worth less than $1 billion. But it's incredibly symbolic. Big supermarkets over the years have introduced fruit departments and bakeries. The meat departments have put butchers out of business. Pharmacies, though, they've always resisted the supermarkets. But health and wellness is a big, growing market. And finally, it looks like the supermarkets might be able to make some inroads. The ball is now in Wesfarmers' court. I think, though, the industry will now change forever.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, this one. So how did markets perform yesterday?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 finished down 0.2%, closing at 7,225 points, with technology stocks doing most of the damage. The banks were mixed, though Commonwealth Bank closed up 2.2%. Transurban was another standout, up a couple of percent, while BHP, Fortescue and Rio were all lower.
And what about overseas markets? What's happened overnight?
Well, Michael, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was speaking, and she warned that the Omicron variant of COVID-19 could slow global economic growth by exacerbating supply chain problems and depressing demand. But that didn't really hurt equity markets, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average and S&P 500 up sharply in early afternoon trading. European markets were lower. In oil markets, Saudi Arabia and its allies in OPEC have agreed to keep increasing monthly crude production. Hopefully, that will keep a lid on prices. Brent crude is currently trading at under $70 a barrel. Gold fell more than 1% overnight, and the Aussie dollar is buying just under 71 US cents.
We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, there's plenty of stories around this morning and a surge in COVID cases announced in Victoria yesterday.
Yes, the state reported 1,419 cases of COVID and 10 deaths. Premier Daniel Andrews hinted that boosters could become part of the no jab, no entry green tick vaccination status. He's also remaining a bit ambiguous about when rules for unvaccinated Victorians will be lifted. South Australia reported 18 new cases, with Premier Stephen Marshall saying it was inevitable that cases would jump once borders with New South Wales and Victoria were reopened. 16 of the cases were linked to a school reunion held on Saturday in Adelaide. Former Premier Jay Weatherill attended the function and caught COVID. Since then, Mr Weatherill was a close contact of several politicians, including the Governor of the state, Frances Adamson. She is now isolating, and the state parliament was adjourned yesterday. Western Australia Premier Mark McGowan said his state was likely to impose tougher restrictions on travellers from South Australia as a result. New South Wales said it had detected its 8th case of the Omicron variant of the coronavirus. The state reported 271 new COVID cases yesterday. The ACT reported 8 new cases, and the Northern Territory and Queensland both reported 1 case.
Okay, now, Sean, a former staffer of Education Minister Alan Tudge, who had an affair with a federal MP in 2017, yesterday alleged it was abusive.
Yes, they're very serious allegations. Mr. Tudge and his former staffer, Rachel Miller, have both previously acknowledged the affair. But yesterday, Ms. Miller said on one occasion it involved physical abuse. It also involved emotional abuse, she claimed. Mr. Tudge said he completely and utterly rejects Ms. Miller's accusations and yesterday stepped aside from his ministerial duties pending an investigation.
Now, I mentioned this one at the top of the show. Crown Resorts has rejected private equity group Blackstone's bid of $12.50 a share, but it wasn't exactly a rejection.
It wasn't. The board of Crown said no, but then invited Blackstone to come and have a look at the gaming giant's books, saying it hopes Blackstone could formulate a revised proposal that better reflects the value of Crown. What's it about? Well, Crown is well and truly in play, and its response to Blackstone may well flush out any other bidders. Obviously, the board and 37% shareholder James Packer want more money, fair enough. But the fact that Crown is inviting Blackstone in shows that they considered the offer serious, and maybe, just maybe, it's not too far from the money. Crown's share price was up slightly yesterday. It's still trading around at $11 a share. That's way below the offer. So clearly big investors aren't convinced it will happen. But if James Packer decides to sell down, and he has to do so eventually as a result of the recommendations from the Victorian Royal Commission, it's game over.
And just quickly, Sean, before we leave the takeover discussion, there were stories in the media yesterday that CSL is in exclusive talks to buy Switzerland-based Wesfarmers for $10 billion.
CSL hasn't confirmed the story, but the Australian is reporting that CSL might raise between $3 and $4 billion for the acquisition. We'll keep a watch on that one.
All right. Now, how about this one, Sean? Former Reserve Bank boss Glenn Stevens has been appointed chair of Macquarie Group from next May.
Yes, it's a very interesting choice. Mr. Stevens will be replacing Peter Warne, who's stepping down. Mr. Stevens ran the Reserve Bank from 2006 to 2016, which was a pretty prosperous time for the Australian economy. The biggest criticism of him was that he lifted interest rates too soon, but all in all, he did a pretty good job running the economy. But he isn't commercial, and Macquarie Group is about as commercial an organisation as there is in banking, and he doesn't have much experience on ASX-listed boards. In fact, he has none. He brings lots of credibility, and he's smart. Everyone who's worked with him agrees on that. Macquarie is a big moving beast with fingers in all sorts of pies. It's pushing hard into infrastructure and it's a very global business. Glenn Stevens is a very interesting choice to lead the organisation. In fact, I'm slightly surprised he even took the job.
Yeah, it's an interesting move. Now, Premier Retail, which includes Smiggle, Peter Alexander, Portman's and Just Jeans, among others, said retail sales are slowly recovering, with sales down just 3.5% for the first 4 months of this year.
Since the beginning of Premier's fiscal year, which was 1 August, it has had to close more than 50% of its stores for long periods due to lockdown. Yet sales have held up really well. That's the good news. The group said it had lost 42,000 trading days across all its stores so far this financial year, which of course is only 4 months old for Premier. In fact, it was only 3 weeks ago that every store reopened. Premier held its virtual AGM yesterday and Chair Solomon Lew said Peter Alexander and Smiggle had both done particularly well. The group will continue to invest in its own brands as well as distribution centres, which of course will help e-commerce.
Sean, I have lost count of the number of Peter Alexander online purchases that have arrived at our house over the last 6 months. So this story does not surprise me at all.
You are supporting Premier.
Certainly am. Now, the $39 billion purchase of Afterpay by Square has been delayed because of regulatory issues.
It was enough to send Afterpay's share price 6% lower yesterday. The biggest deal in Australian corporate history has hit a hurdle after Spanish regulators delayed approvals in its jurisdiction. It's probably only a delay though. Now, not helping was a big fall in Square's share price on Wall Street. Remember, Afterpay shareholders will be receiving Square stock. So what happens in that company hits Afterpay. Having said all that, Square is Square no longer. In fact, it's Block, as in the company Square has changed its name to Block. I have no idea why.
Okay, Sean, what's making headlines in today's news media?
The Financial Review is reporting that interest payments on $1.3 trillion of state and federal debt will grow to $34 billion by the 2025 financial year, as Australia's strong economic bounce back reduces debt but pushes interest rates higher. That is the downside of all the government spending of the last couple of years. And The Australian is reporting that a new jobs program will directly link Australians with disabilities to industries suffering worker shortages, and autistic children will receive more help with their first year of school under a landmark national scheme.
Running through some of the other stories around today, the chief executive of Santos, Kevin Gallagher, yesterday said he was confident that Oil Search shareholders would vote for the planned $21 billion merger with Santos next week. Proxy votes were due in yesterday, and Mr. Gallagher said he'd received indications that the deal will go ahead.
The Fair Work Ombudsman has commenced court proceedings against Coles following an error in staff pay. The Ombudsman began an investigation early last year, and it's now alleging Coles underpaid 7,812 workers by $115 million. Coles has since paid $13 million in remediation and has plans for a further $12 million in payments. I'm not standing up for Coles here, but so many retailers are struggling to pay staff the correct amounts. I'm not sure the modern awards have been simplified enough.
And finally, Sean, Greg Hunt formally announced his decision to retire from federal parliament at the next federal election. The health minister thanked his staff and paid tribute to Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Interestingly, he also called for a woman to replace him in his Victorian seat of Flinders. So we'll see what happens there. What's the key overseas news this morning?
The Omicron variant of the coronavirus has been detected in the United States after an individual in California tested positive. The individual is fully vaccinated and is showing only mild symptoms. There have also been cases reported in Ireland, Norway and South Korea. Authorities said current vaccines should mostly protect against serious cases of the variant. Apple has conceded that it's facing slower demand, particularly for its iPhone 13 lineup, according to a report in Bloomberg. The company is still on track for a record holiday season, with sales expected to rise 6% to about $118 billion for the final 3 months of the calendar year. And finally, the Women's Professional Tennis Tour is suspending all tournaments in China, including Hong Kong, in response to the disappearance from public life of tennis star Peng Shuai. It comes after Ms. Shuai claimed on her social media channels that she was sexually assaulted by a top member of the Chinese government. The Chinese government has raised all mentions of the incident and all discussion of Shuai, who disappeared from public life about 2 weeks ago.
It's a really disturbing story, that one.
Sure is.
Now, up next is the Daily Interview, and today you're talking to Cameron Falloon, the founder of the fitness group BFT.
Yes, they've just raised money out of the US and become part of a bigger umbrella global group. Cameron's been a personal trainer for many famous people, including Lady Di. In fact, it's a really fascinating chat.
Yeah, certainly is. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Friday, the 3rd of December 2021. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.